Welcome to the We Wonder podcast. I'm your host, Jason Schlachter, and this is the podcast where we talk about science, technology, and its impact on society. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe to get new episode alerts. We're also on social media. On Twitter and Facebook, you can find us at We Wonder Podcast. You can also shoot us an email at feedback@wewonderpodcast.com. We'd love to hear what you think about the show. Also, feel free to send us topic requests, guest requests, or do you know somebody that should be on the show? Let us know. We look forward to it. And now, let's kick things off. Welcome everyone to the podcast. Today we've got Vineet Khosla. Vineet is a friend of mine who went to grad school with me for artificial intelligence. He has since worked at Siri. He was one of the founding members of Siri and grew the company from a simple app where you could, maybe order pizza into the global phenomenon it is now. He's since left Apple and gone to Uber, where he's an AI leader at Uber. And so really excited to have you on the show, Vineet. Been looking forward to catching up with you for a while. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Jason. This is a great place to be. As you said, we've been friends for a long time. We had all those dreams when we were doing our masters in artificial intelligence. And I think, none of us imagined where we would be. And more important, I don't think we ever imagined how fast the industry will move and embrace AI as like a core pillar of the technology. Nowadays, there is an AI for everything. So it's a really exciting time to be alive.
Absolutely. I'm so glad to be alive for AI and for other reasons as well. Yeah, man, I completely agree. And I think even for you and I, we didn't see how quickly things would be going. I remember graduating and there were very few AI jobs available back then. I remember my parents asking me, why are you studying AI? Get a real job, you know? And Vineet and I, we worked together briefly as well. We worked at a company called Mindbox, which actually was a later version of the Inference Corporation. Inference Corporation being one of the very first AI companies really in existence. And Mindbox was a rule-based expert system for mortgage approvals and investment bankers. One of the key memories I have with Vineet is, and this is a frustrating one, was the day that you came to me when we were at Mindbox and said, hey, I think I'm going to go and build a company called Siri. You want to come? And I was like, no. I'm like in Manhattan consulting with these investment banks, making good money. My family's on the East Coast. Like, are you crazy? And I think you even showed me a version of the app. Like, it was really like, I think this was like even pre-iPhone, and or maybe it was like the iPhone had just come out, but it was like a really basic app. And when I saw that, I was like, I felt vindicated in like my no. I was like, well, I'm glad I said no to that.
Yeah, you're right, Jason. That was iPhone 3. I had been working with Siri for a few months by then. And it's an interesting trajectory because at Mindbox, we were doing rule-based systems. From there on, I went on to San Diego for another mortgage company, which was doing similar type of systems. But they happened to be using a JBoss open source system called Rules, which was their replacement to the RETI algorithm. And when I was doing that thing in San Diego, writing still financial mortgage type of application using Rules, JBoss RETI algorithm open source version, these guys who started Siri, the co-founders, contacted me because I was contributing some code back to Rules. And one of the first iteration of Siri's natural language system was heavily rules-based. Now, of course, over dozens of years, there is data, and data leads to more machine learning algorithms. But initially, when we started out, it was a logical system. It was a reasoning system. It was built in 2008. And that's how I got into Siri. I was contributing source code. The co-founders, Adam Chaya, they found me. They brought me over to interview. And, when I saw the prototype, because these were a bunch of guys from SRI, Stanford Research Institute, so They were a spin-off of SRI, and they had been working in the space of natural language and automation, and a lot of the efforts were, I think, initially sponsored by DARPA, and their stuff was about how do you make an office worker more efficient by letting the emails be read automatically and meetings scheduled and whatnot. But these guys had a very consumer take. They were like, no, talking to your computer is actually for everyone.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And one of the visionary things that Adam Chyer and the CEO, Doc Kitlos, made me realize was, why do you search the web? You search the web to do something, right? Fair enough. What if we build a system that can bypass the search and just get you to do something? So when we launched Siri, we could buy movie tickets, we could book restaurants, we could book flights and hotels, and you could check on things like weather, and they were contextual. So you could do stuff like, what's the weather in New York? And we would say, oh, it's nice and sunny. Then you say, like, I'm looking for a nice romantic table for two. Then we would say, like, it's nice and sunny. Maybe we should suggest something with outdoor seating. So the initial cut of Siri was, the way it is right now is an assistant to your phone. It's your iPhone helper. It's your Apple TV helper. I cannot imagine typing stuff on Apple TV. But when we built the first version, it was very consumer focused.
Yeah, and
that's the rough scope of it.
And that was really like, maybe not everybody realizes, but like, Siri was built outside of Apple, and it was its own company and its own app. And so like, when you talk about this, you're not like, so everybody kind of understands, you're not talking about, a vision that Apple had or work that was being done at Apple. You guys were you had your own vision, you were building this. It just so happened that you had an app in the Apple ecosystem. It wasn't until a few years later that Apple actually acquired Siri, and that's probably when, the vast majority of people who have ever used or heard of Siri really had it on their radar, right?
Yeah, that's true. It was within the first few months of Siri being launched on iPhone. At that time, we were fortunate enough to catch the eye of the iOS executive Scott Forstall,
nice.
Who brought it to Steve's attention, and they both were really the spearhead. They were spearheading the purchase of Siri.
Yeah.
They were the ones who were most excited by the vision, and they knew where the world was going. They knew that talking to your phones is just the right user interface. You can spend years and years designing, but talking is already done. We as humans have already said, like, this is the best way to get to know each other, to talk to each other, to get each other to do things.
Yeah.
Versus when we come to our devices, there is this finger which is the touching point. It's like, this is not natural. When I go over to talk to you, Jason, I might tap you on your shoulder once to get your attention. Right? But after that, we just talk.
You're like, stop tapping me, Vineet.
Yeah. So imagine if it was Morse code and I was just tapping you nonstop to
get
stuff done. But I think that was the vision that these guys had in Apple.
Yeah.
Way beyond anybody else, which was conversational interface. As I say, CI is the new UI. Yeah, this is it. And imagine how many markets it unlocks, right? Like, you got this immense group of people in countries outside of US who probably don't read and write, or don't read and write really well, and find technology daunting. And they've never been really able to unlock all the wins of the technology. But now, in India and other places, if they can just talk to their phone, it's done. They don't have to do anything extra. They just have to learn how to press one button, summon Siri or any other assistant they want, and then just talk to it.
Hey, Vineet, that's an interesting point, because, if you talk about like third world countries like India, or maybe places in Africa, there are people who are just illiterate, and those people, I guess, can't really interact with any sort of textual system that isn't either reading aloud to them or allowing them to speak to it. That's kind of interesting. I wonder how much of that is like an agent of change. I know ideally you'd want to educate people and get them to be able to read, and that's a whole other thing that I'm sure people are doing. But like, there must be some segment of the population that's like, oh my God, I can use a computer for the first time.
Yeah, and this is a multi-layered change, right? Like, first in those regions, you need cell phone network connectivity to come. Then you need cheap handheld devices to come, right? And it's only after that the third wave, which is how do you interact with those devices, come. And I think the first two have happened.
Yeah.
If you go to India, you will find maybe about like 10 years ago, there were more cell phone connections in India than landlines. We had already outstripped the number of landlines. There is an explosion of cheap handheld devices. Having that, the third wave comes now, which is the conversational AI needs to evolve where it stops being a playground for the rich and the educated, which is kind of what it is now. And it needs to be a force of good for everybody else. All the use cases we have done using conversational AI, even with Alexa, and Google Assistant maybe goes a little bit more because they consider India as like a big market, so they probably cater to it more. But I know like Siri, Alexa, these markets are not primary, right? Like they just don't have that much usage. It doesn't make sense. But I think that's where the next wave is coming, where people will unlock the power of voice for huge, huge continents.
Hey, so what do you think that means? Like when you talk about AI for good or conversational, interfaces for good versus what they are now, like what's the differential there?
People need to think about use cases for those markets. I think it starts with the product, right? What are people doing with their phones in India? Actually, a lot of them are using it for money transfer because banking facilities don't exist, physical banks don't exist in a lot of places, cell phone does. So there are a lot of apps and / systems built in India where farmers can pay each other using text messages. And there is like an independent third-party app which is keeping track. It's like an electronic bank. So that's great. Now, what if you could just use voice and find out whether you have enough money before you initiate a transfer, whether Jason paid you? So electronic banking becomes one of those things because even in its current form, you need to know how to read and write to actually use that. Right?
Okay, yeah.
So you can go another step and you can say, I'll start using voice to do all my banking, and I can do a simple set of use cases. Okay, how much money do I have today? Did the money Jason owed me came in? Okay, that means I have now money to pay somebody else for whatever service.
Hey, let's not talk about the money I owe you on this podcast. I'm just kidding.
Right, by the way, that's upwards of $10 million.
Yeah.
Just in case anyone's keeping record.
This is the $10 million that Jason owes me. Did it come through? Hey Siri, send Vineet $10 million. Yeah, that
actually works. That's that domain.
That's interesting. Yeah. So financial transactions, that makes sense. So when did the transition from like rule-based systems to more of a machine learning approach happen? Because I feel like at Apple, Apple was obviously the leader in these voice interfaces, with smartphones, but like, Amazon really spun up their systems, I think, much faster in terms of building out third-party tools, building in skills. And Google really bet really heavy on machine learning from day one, and they kind of came in late, right? And they kind of came in with no legacy platform and no legacy users, and they kind of built up. But it seemed like Apple kind of held on to this rule-based approach for longer. Like, when was the transition, or is it still rule-based in part?
No, that's. I think I would probably answer it in a different way, which was like there is no like a transition, right? There is a system that was supporting millions of users and more accurate than anything else. Do keep in mind, even the speech engine at that time was heavily machine learned, right?
Yeah.
Machine learning systems evolve, and one by one, we picked at pieces of Siri that made sense to be moved over to a more data-driven solution.
Yeah.
And we transitioned them. So it was never, I think like in terms of pure tech, we were never behind. The only thing we were behind is like we never talked about it much.
Okay.
So that's a big difference. Before, I think 2014, 15, when I really pushed to invent SiriKit and launched it to public, before that, Siri was completely internal.
Yeah.
So no matter what we did, like all the tools we had, we never had a need to tell the world what they were doing. So it wasn't until 2014, 15 we started being more public, and that was also partially to give confidence to our developers that, when we launched SiriKit, that it's actually backed by a lot of machine learning. So what you see with Google and Alexa, I think their market was different, simply put, right? Like the people they were going after developers from day one.
Yeah.
And Apple's vision was Siri is your trusted assistant that lives on your phone. So Apple, in its typical privacy-sensitive fashion, kept everything inside.
Yeah.
Till I could give them a good story around SiriKit, which was, one of the, I think, crowning achievements of my time at Apple is like I finally convinced Apple to open up Siri to third-party developers.
Yeah, that's cool. So I mean, I remember that you were working on SiriKit, and I remember that at the Apple Developers Conference, like you gave a presentation because I saw your posts around that time. But so you were driving the development of SiriKit and opening up Siri to third-party developers.
Yeah,
that's so cool.
Me and a really good team.
Yeah, of course.
Nothing gets done in isolation.
Of course.
There was a core team with me and Siri. They were, our fine friends at developer conference people who help develop Xcode, people who vet apps, everything, like the entire ecosystem.
Yeah, that's fair.
Behind it. What
do you think the end game is for these voice assistants? So imagine, that we're working towards some goal, and at some point we'll sort of arrive at some sort of stable state for this kind of technology. Immediately before it no longer matters because we have neural implants and we never speak anymore. What would that end game look like for you? Like, what's your vision for that? What's Apple's vision, or are they the same?
Yeah, I don't think anyone has really put the end goal vision out. And yes, your question is really good, right? Like, has anyone even thought of it? And my answer probably is no. None of us have thought of it. And I've thought about what an ideal situation for me would be, right? Like, I think ambient computing, where it stops being a thing that you have to invoke by taking a physical device out. So I'm moving more towards ambient computing in my life. I feel like speakers are step 0.01 in that direction, right?
Yeah, that's fair.
So it's in your house. It probably should not be in your office, but it's like in a nice privacy way. There is a really good story about how your data is your data and it doesn't leave you, and the system can function and it can work on your behalf. And it's proactive. I think that's the big difference between what we have now versus where I want the future to be. Currently, our assistants you summon them like your servants. They're not a true assistant. A true assistant will know in advance things about you and do things that will surprise and delight you. Now, it's also a lot like building a car, right? When they first built a car, it was completely built by hand. Mm-hmm. And eventually, moving it to an assembly line was heralded as the biggest technology revolution of its time. And I'm sure people who built the first cars never thought driverless cars is the end game. So it evolves, right? And I think that's the same thing that's going to happen with assistants is it's going to evolve. It's we, the users, we, the consumers, are going to define its use cases. And I think ambient computing, like we have spoken overwhelmingly in favor of it, saying, yes, we want the speaker in a room, then in our bedroom, then in our living room, then I want all of them to talk to each other, and I want them to play music, and this is okay with me. So I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we reach privacy-sensitive ambient computing. I'll be very happy.
That's interesting because I think even like the I see you wearing like you got your AirPods on as we're talking, and like AirPods are almost the next extension of that too in some sense, right? Because like when the headphones are light enough and comfortable enough, and you've got them on, and they're sensing your blood pressure or your pulse, and they're listening to your voice, sort of like the enabler. I know Bose has like their augmented reality glasses that they came out with recently, and the Bose glasses are just like audio based. There's no visual component for the augmented reality, but it tracks where you're looking and where you are in space. So like if you're walking through a city and you stop to look at like a monument, like your Bose AR glasses could be like, hey, we noticed you're looking at this monument. Would you like to know more about it? And it's like it's kind of awesome. It's like one of the first times I've seen like an augmented reality system where I'd be like, I'd use that. Like that. I haven't bought it, so yeah. I guess I'd use it in principle. If I actually would use it, I'd buy it. But it was sort of like insightful for me.
I think that this is a generation after Google Glasses, I take it.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So I've not looked at the Bose ones. I was really closely looking at the Google glasses, and I think it's about getting the use cases right, Jason, right? Like as you mentioned, these are great tools when you're traveling and touring. These are a privacy intrusion if you're not doing that and just living your daily life. So whatever products we design have to be well thought out.
Yeah.
They have to be well thought out. Like we cannot shove technology and expect it to fly on its own. It has to solve a real problem for us. And I think that was the thing with Siri and conversational AI. It was actually solving a real problem. And I'll tell you guys, like the thing that I've done the most with Siri is actually set an alarm clock.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, on an app, you have to unlock the phone, open an app, scroll for the day of week, scroll for the hour, scroll for the minute, scroll to AM, PM, choose a ringtone.
Yeah.
And with Siri, all I could say was, wake me up at 7 tomorrow.
Absolutely.
And done. Right? Like it just worked. So I think that's where all the AI companies need to be like really focused on is like, what does it actually do for the user?
Well, there's certain kind of use cases where the distance between how quickly you can say something in speech and the simplicity of what you're asking for and the number of user interface interactions that are needed, even given like a best-in-class UI, like those use cases are probably the most interesting. And the alarm clock's a great example. Like if you think about how simple it is to ask for a wake-up call or like an alarm at a certain time versus how many steps you have to go through, there's a big distance there given like how simple the request is. I actually use Siri a lot for alarm clocks, for timers. I use it for messaging my wife, like just bring up my watch and ask it to do something. I also can like send locations from my phone to my car now, which is great. But here's an interesting question for you. I remember talking to Tom Gruber, who I think was your boss, right, at Apple?
Yeah.
So Tom was head of Siri, and we talked at NIPS a couple years ago, and I remember talking to him about like how kids perceive Alexa and Siri, and he told me that there's a lot of studies that Apple's doing, studies that others are doing in terms of like how different people see digital assistants as sort of anthropomorphic, like as people versus digital compute. And in doing that, like he was talking about how kids up until the age of 7 don't easily distinguish between digital assistants and computers. And I know that's true from personal experience because like when we bought new light bulbs that were like able to be controlled by Alexa, my son at the time, who I guess he was like 3 or 4 at the time, he ran over to Alexa and he was like, "Hey, Alexa, are you excited about your new light bulbs?" And it was like, "I don't understand your query." And I was like, "That's fascinating." And then we had this long conversation about like Siri doesn't have emotions. And it was like, why? Why doesn't Siri have emotions? Well, because it's a computer. Oh, well, where does Siri live, or Alexa live? And so I remember talking to Tom about this, and he mentioned that there's research that you guys are doing in this space. So here's the question. There are people who don't want to use Siri and don't use digital assistants. And there's people like me who use them for a lot of things, and like you who use them for a lot of things. Is there like a difference, like psychologically, like personality-wise, in people who are embracing these voice interactive assistants versus not? Is it an education thing? Is it just a habit? Because my hypothesis would be this: like if you took, if you did a science experiment and you take people who are generally, not interested in using voice assistants, and you took people who are generally interested in using them, and you did some kind of like personality assessment or cognitive assessment, I bet you'd see some statistically significant differences across those groups. I could be completely wrong, so tell me if you think that's completely nonsense. But if it's not, I'm curious if Apple has ever sort of looked at, how those demographics differ.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there are a bunch of smart people in Apple who are doing these studies.
Yeah.
I was not heavily involved with any one of them. But I do think there are a few groups of people. One of them, as you mentioned, right, like that we have observed, and I think Google and Alexa have caught on very early, are kids and children. And that's why I think the community has the ethical responsibility to be very privacy sensitive, because a lot of kids and children are using these devices. So they need to react more strongly than what they're doing now. But for them, this is the most natural thing to do because they have not learned the touch. right? So there is this generation that knows how to speak, therefore are most comfortable speaking to the technology, to the devices, to the TVs, and my son's 19-month-old, and the shameful family secret is his first words were almost "Okay, Google." Because we were using "Okay, Google" so much to like, "Okay, Google, what does an elephant sound like? What does to
Oh my
distract him
God.
when he's crying?"
That's so cool.
We came very close to that, but thankfully it was still "Mama." We dodged that bullet. But I think that's the generation, right? Like they're speaking, they don't know touch,
Yeah.
they don't know they have
Yeah.
to use fingers.
Yeah.
So this is very natural to them. Then there is a generation which got brought up on touch,
Yeah.
right? Like they're used to tablets and phones and devices.
That's my
So
6-year-old.
for them, yeah, so they can text faster with their fingers than they could probably think and type, think and speak. So they are just still preferring the modality of touch. Then you go to the other side of the spectrum where I see like people like the age of my mom and dad, right?
Mm-hmm.
They never were, like in their prime of their life, they were never computer users because that was not required at their job, right? And then they retired, and then suddenly there were these computers and they had to touch and they had to buy Windows, God forbid, and like everything was so complicated. So to them, when I give iPhones and I give Siri, they're back to the comfort zone, right? Like they're like, oh, I just tell this what to do.
Yeah.
So my mom has to just say, FaceTime my son, and like then it's done. Or she will say my name because she has 2 sons, and I don't want to keep my name in her address book as son. But
Son
for
1,
them,
son 2.
this is a really good technology because
Right.
now they can just do exactly what they like to do, talk,
Yeah.
and it gets
Yeah.
the job done for them. So I think it's more of, I kind of go back all the, like my life lessons is it's about the use cases. Listen to your product people, talk to your product, like make engineering and product, fuse them together to see, are you solving a real problem? And I think people who are not using Siri a lot, there's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with Siri. It's just not solving a real problem for them. And you will find situations like CarPlay, right? Like once we put Siri in CarPlay, the number of people who were not using Siri, I think there was a shift because some of the people we found that were not using Siri before started using it more because they were driving.
Yeah.
Now they found like, oh, texting is so much easy and safe if I can use Siri. And that unlocked a bunch of other use cases for them.
Yeah. Yeah,
So you
that's.
gotta solve a core problem, a core need first.
Do you ride share your way to work every day?
Part of it.
Yeah?
I still use public transit.
Oh, awesome.
I still use BART quite a bit, and
Awesome.
I think kind of like the stated goal of Uber is it's not a replacement. It's there to help you. It's like the transportation for everyone, right? So you pick what's the right thing to do at that point of time, and Uber helps you with the rest. In fact, I was so surprised. I came to New York and non-work related stuff, and I realized Uber app has public transit integrated in it here. So I can actually pay for public transit using the Uber app and then jump into Uber and go the rest of the way, and it's like all seamlessly done.
That's awesome. I actually would love to take public transport. Like I love my car and it's a lot of fun, but I would happily give it up if I had good public transport. It's just well, you lived
You're
here.
in Atlanta.
Yeah, Atlanta is not. There's certain narrow corridors of good public transport. Like my office is right next to a MARTA station, so I mean on the office side, I mean if I could pop out of that station, I'd be perfect. But there's no way to get to that station. Hey, so that's a good segue. So awesome talking about the Apple stuff. Super interesting. Let's transition to your new role for the last year or so. Is you're leading AI at Uber. So let's talk a little bit about that. Like what was it like to transition from Apple to Uber? Like what was it like culturally, and what kind of problems do you solve, and how does that shift been?
Yeah, it's a very different role. It's, to begin with, got nothing to do with conversational AI. This is maps and routing. So I'm in charge of the routing engine for Uber Maps. It's an internal product. Most of the time our drivers see it. Our riders will basically see it for a few seconds, when they're booking a ride. So anytime you see a squiggly line showing you that you're going from point A to point B, and then it tells you it will take you 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and that's me. That's my team right now. We make the squiggly line. We find the best squiggly line between point A and point B. And then we tell the driver that this would be a good thing for you to do if you choose to do so. But driver partners are always free to choose whichever navigation system they want to use. And then we estimate how long it will take you, because your fares are kind of built on. So it's a very difficult. This is where the what I say is the proverbial rubber meets the real road situation. Everything we do over here has massive real world implications.
Yeah. And what's the reason why Uber would go after their own routing system versus using like is it because it's like a core competency that they think they can do better with, or they have different things they're optimizing on, or what's the reason why you wouldn't use an existing one?
Yeah, I think a lot of this, without giving too much away, is like, think about the core use cases, right? Like Apple, Google are they're a map solution for an individual person. They live on your phone. They take you on your phone from one place to another. If you're late by 5 minutes, who cares? If you're on the wrong side of the street, who cares? The impact, you care, obviously, but at Uber, we are building a transportation solution, right? So our use cases, even though we are Uber Maps, are actually very vastly different. The QPS that we have to deal with to build the Uber marketplace is vastly different. So the scale is vastly different. The latency requirements are vastly different. The accuracy requirements are really, really difficult, right? So if you're off by 20 meters when you're taking Apple or Google, right, like it doesn't matter. You can look around. Think about the core problem Uber is solving. It's trying to connect two moving entities in time and space, right? If the driver reaches there early and the rider isn't there, then that's a problem. It's a bad experience. The driver partner has to wait, the traffic gets held up. If the rider reaches early and the driver isn't there, then that's a bad experience because you have to wait and WhatsApp a little bit or Instagram a little bit because there's nothing to do. So the ideal situation is these two moving entities meet at the right point in time and space. And we at Maps are at the heart of it, right? Like we have to find that point. We have to tell that time. And then our market matches up people based on that. So when we are off by 30 seconds, it's a broken experience.
Wow. So how do you do that?
It's a lot of hard work.
I thought it was easy. So how do you optimize on that? What kind of data do you need? Where does it come from? How do you measure success or failure on that? Is that stuff you can talk about?
Most of it I can probably not talk about, but I don't think it's even important to know the exact details on like how it's being done. It's probably more, I think, important for people to realize that the problem Uber Maps solves is very different than Apple Maps and Google Maps.
Yeah.
So the success metrics that would be, if you think about Apple and Google Maps, they've basically become a de facto search front end, right? Like people go into them to do less about navigation and it's less about routing. It's actually a search endpoint, right? Like people open their maps to find things to go to. The routing happens later. That's kind of true with Uber, but in our case of the routing engine, that's not like, you're not going to try and find the closest McDonald's to take an Uber to it, right? You'll probably use Uber Eats if you want to do that, if you want McDonald's. So it's less of search, it's more of routing. We deal a lot with graph search. We are doing like the classical computer science stuff that you get taught in school. And you hardly ever use it, and you're like, who is ever going to use that? Oh, man, A-star. If you and I remember, we took that class with Dr. Potter where we had to make the Bumble agent using...
I remember that.
Write our own A-star algorithm. Well, guess what? I get to do A star in production now.
And you had to
So
make
this
sure that
is
you had to make sure that the heuristic was admissible. Because if
exactly.
the heuristic isn't admissible, you end up on a suboptimal path, right?
And you never ever want to do that because I said with Uber, it's all about getting two physical entities to meet in time and space, man. So you gotta really get good about your estimates here. So
That's crazy.
even though I
Yeah.
cannot talk too much about the technology, and like
Okay.
I hope it makes sense that why Uber Maps is its own thing,
Yeah.
and then you slowly realize it's actually the heart of Uber, right? Like this, everything powers from here. Like if we are off, if we give bad directions, we throw our driver partners off. They cannot make to the next stop. They will earn less. So that's not a good situation. Same thing with our riders. Same thing with Uber Eats. If your delivery person is off, they're on a bicycle and we put them on a route that takes them on a highway. Like that sucks. We should not do that. So stuff like that is, in essence, like why Uber Maps is an entirely different ballgame, and that's why I'm so excited, right? Like I wanted a break from conversational AI and just talking to the Uber Maps people and getting introduced to the team. It blew my mind. I was like, wow, what deep implication for every line of code we write. Being in Uber, you go like, wow, the real world implications of everything we do here, so freaking profound, man. Like it's humbling. I think if I could describe my time at Uber as one thing, I would say it's humbling.
That's a great attitude to have about it. I mean, the reach you have with what you're doing right now is incredible in terms of how you're bringing AI to the masses. So thanks for coming on the show. I know we're running out of time. I really appreciate you talking through the founding of Siri and what it's become today and voice interfaces in general. To our listeners, thanks for being here. We really appreciate it. It's a lot of fun to do these shows. And of course, what makes it the most fun is to have an audience. So if you like this and you haven't listened to episode 1 or 2, go ahead and check those out. Those are great episodes as well. First one is about what is AI. Second one is industrial automation. If you're using a podcast app to listen to this and you haven't followed or subscribed, go ahead and do that. That way, when we drop new episodes, you'll get notifications and you'll be able to listen to them. Until then, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.